When a black woman CEO refused to give up her first-class seat to an entitled white man, the plane didn't just delay. An entire conversation about power, dignity, and quiet resistance took flight. The early morning sun was just starting to rise when Jacqueline Evans stepped out of the black car in front of the airport. She was calm, focused, and dressed in a dark blue suit that made her look exactly like what she was, a powerful CEO. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her phone was in one hand, her passport and boarding pass in the other. The driver quickly helped her with her single carry-on bag. Jacqueline preferred to travel light. She had learned over the years that strength didn't always come from how much you carried. It came from how you carried yourself. Jacqueline was not new to business travel. In fact, she had flown so many times over the last decade that she knew most of the staff at major airlines by name. This flight was supposed to be quick, just a short hop to another city for a board meeting. She was used to tight schedules, quick decisions, and high-pressure environments. Her company had recently closed a major deal, and even though she was tired, she was also proud. She had done it, led the team, negotiated the terms, and signed the contract that would grow their business faster than ever. This flight, in her mind, was just one more ordinary step in a very busy week. As she made her way through the airport, people looked at her, some with curiosity, some with admiration. A black woman walking confidently in a sharp suit, holding a platinum frequent flyer card. It wasn't something they saw every day. But Jacqueline didn't let stares slow her down. She had learned long ago to walk past whispers, to ignore the doubters, and to let her work speak louder than their opinions. Security was smooth. Her status let her go through the priority line. And in no time, she was sitting in the lounge with a cup of green tea and her laptop open. Emails flooded her screen, but she answered each one with the same calm attention she always gave. Deadlines didn't scare her. People's judgments didn't shake her. She had come too far for that. When it was time to board, she packed up and walked calmly to the gate. Her seat was 2A, a first-class window seat. She didn't request upgrades anymore. She earned them. As she stood in line to board, she overheard a few people talking about business, politics, and even a few awkward jokes about how tired they were of flying. She smiled softly to herself. Most of the men around her were dressed casually, in jeans or polo shirts. She stood out, but she didn't mind. Once she stepped onto the plane, a flight attendant smiled at her. "Welcome aboard, Miss Evans," the woman said. Jacqueline nodded politely and stepped into the first-class cabin. She was ready to sit down, relax, and maybe read a chapter from the new book she'd been carrying for weeks but never had time to open. But as she reached her seat, as she paused, there was someone already sitting there, a white man. Maybe in his mid-40s, was leaning back comfortably in the seat with his legs crossed and a newspaper in his hand. He looked up briefly, noticed her standing there, then looked back at his paper as if she didn't exist. Jacqueline was used to handling uncomfortable situations, so she approached politely. "Excuse me," she said in a calm tone. "I believe this is my seat too, eh?" The man didn't look up this time. "I don't think so," he replied casually. "You must be mistaken. Check your ticket."
Jacqueline
Raised her eyebrows slightly. She had already checked her ticket more than once. Still, she pulled it out and showed him. "No mistake," she said gently. "That's my seat." The man sighed and finally looked at the ticket. Then, instead of moving or apologizing, he chuckled a little and said, "Well, you can just take another seat. What's the big deal?" She paused. The words sounded simple, but the tone was full of something else, something ugly, dismissive, entitled. He didn't care that it was her seat. He didn't care that she had paid for it or earned it through years of travel and work. He didn't even care that he was wrong. He just assumed she would move. "I'd prefer to sit in the seat assigned to me," she said, still keeping her voice steady. That's when the man gave a little smirk and said something that made her stomach turn. "You sure you're in the right section? You might want to check the back of the plane." His voice was low, but his meaning was loud. He didn't say it directly, but he didn't have to. He was saying she didn't belong there. That a woman like her, a black woman, didn't fit in a seat like Tua. Not in first class, not in front, not in power. For a moment, the plane felt silent. The flight attendant, who had been watching from a few steps away, walked over slowly. "Is everything all right here?" she asked with a careful smile. Jacqueline looked at the attendant and held out her boarding pass again. "Yes, I'm in 2A, she said simply. The attendant nodded. "Yes, you are," she said after a glance at the manifest. Then she turned to the man. "Sir, I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat." The man gave an annoyed laugh. "Come on, it's just a seat. You really want to delay the flight over?" The attendant hesitated. Jacqueline saw it. That moment of discomfort, the small shift in her eyes, the awkward pause. She didn't want to push the man. She didn't want to cause a scene. And for a second, it looked like she might even ask Jacqueline to move instead, to just let it go. But Jacqueline stood firm. "I'm not moving," she said softly but clearly. "This is my seat." The attendant tried again. "Sir, can I see your boarding pass?" The man sighed again, clearly annoyed. He pulled out a crumpled boarding pass from his jacket pocket and handed it over. The attendant looked at it, and her eyebrows raised. "Sir, you're in seat 8C, she said, trying to stay professional. "That's an economy." He looked at her, then at Jacqueline, and then back at his paper. "I'm already sitting," he said. "Let her take my seat. It's not a big deal." Jacqueline blinked slowly. She felt the familiar sting, not from his words alone, but from the way he said them, as if he was doing her a favor by stealing her seat, as if he still didn't understand or care that he was wrong. The attendant looked torn. Other passengers were starting to board now, and she clearly didn't want a confrontation. "Ms. Evans," she said hesitantly, "would you mind just taking another seat while we sort this out? We're on a tight schedule." Jacqueline felt something tighten. In her chest, would she mind? Yes. She did mind. She had spent her whole life working harder than most people ever had to. She had studied through nights when others slept, fought to be heard in rooms where her voice was ignored, led teams that didn't always trust her, and earned respect from people who thought she didn't deserve to lead. And now, because one man thought he had more right to her seat, she was being asked again to step aside. "No." She shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I'm not giving up my seat." Her voice was still calm, but now there was steel behind it. Strength that came from years of being told to wait, to move, to let it go. The attendant nodded quietly. "Understood," she said, and turned to call for a supervisor, as the man continued to read his paper. Pretending not to notice the growing tension, Jacqueline remained standing beside her seat. She wasn't angry, but she was disappointed. Disappointed that this kind of thing still happened. Disappointed that the crew hesitated. Disappointed that this man didn't even feel embarrassed. But she stood with grace, with dignity, because she knew who she was, and she wasn't moving. Jacqueline continued standing quietly next to her seat, her boarding pass still in hand. The man in her seat had gone back to reading his newspaper as if nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. Round them, other passengers began settling into their places. Some noticed the situation and whispered to each other, while others pretended not to see. The energy in the air had changed. It was heavy with tension, a mixture of discomfort, curiosity, and silent judgment. The flight attendant had gone to call a supervisor, and Jacqueline was left waiting. A few passengers looked at her with confused expressions. One man leaned forward and asked, "Is everything okay?" Jacqueline gave a small smile and nodded, even though she wasn't okay at all. She had faced this kind of treatment before, subtle but sharp. It was the kind of disrespect that didn't scream but whispered, quietly cutting into your pride. And this time, it wasn't just about a seat. It was about something deeper, something she had been dealing with her whole life. As she stood there, her mind traveled back to all the times she had been made to feel like she didn't belong. The first time she walked into a business school classroom and realized she was the only black woman there. The countless times clients assumed she was an assistant, not the CEO. The interviews where people looked surprised to learn about her degrees and experience. The boardrooms where her ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them louder. She had stayed silent during many of those moments. But not today. The man in her seat glanced at her again, this time with a smirk still standing there. He asked, You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Jacqueline stayed calm. This isn't about difficulty, she said. It's about respect. He shrugged. It's just a seat. Why are you making it into a drama? She looked him in the eye. Because I'm tired of being told to move aside when I've earned my place.
Right.
For a brief second, the smirk on his face faded. But he quickly shook his head and looked back at his paper, pretending not to care. His attitude wasn't just about arrogance. It was about something uglier. A belief that he didn't need to listen to her, that she didn't matter. When the supervisor arrived, Jacqueline felt a small wave of relief. Maybe now things would be handled properly. The supervisor was a middle-aged man in a crisp uniform. He approached with the flight attendant behind him and a forced smile on his face. "Good morning," he said politely. "I understand there's some confusion with seating." Jacqueline explained the situation again, clearly, calmly, without anger. She showed her boarding pass and pointed to the man sitting in her seat. The supervisor turned to the man. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" he asked. The man rolled his eyes and handed it over. The supervisor looked at it, nodded, and then returned it. Double quotes, "Yes, sir, you're in 8C, he said. "I'll have to ask you to move to your assigned seat." The man didn't move. He looked at the supervisor with an annoyed expression. "This is ridiculous," he said. "It's just a seat. Can't she just sit somewhere else?" Supervisor paused. Jacqueline could see the hesitation again, the same discomfort she saw in the flight attendant earlier. It was like watching someone trying not to offend the wrong person. Jacqueline had seen that look many times in restaurants, meetings, interviews where people chose to avoid confrontation instead of doing the right thing. "She's asking for what she's paid for," supervisor said, but his voice was weak. "If you could please move to your seat, we'd like to start boarding the rest of the plane." The man sighed loudly, then leaned back in the seat. "I'm not moving. You guys are wasting time. Just let her take 8C. More passengers were watching now. Some looked confused. Some looked uncomfortable. No one said anything. Jacqueline crossed her arms. She could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had been treated as invisible, about every young girl who might one day sit in that seat and be told she didn't belong. "I'm not moving to 8C, she said firmly. "This is my seat." The supervisor gave a tight smile and nodded. "Understood, ma'am. Give us a moment." He turned and walked to the front of the plane to make a phone call. Jacqueline stayed where she was. The man in her seat had now put his feet up and was pretending to sleep, as if the entire issue was beneath him. His behavior wasn't just rude, it was deeply disrespectful. He didn't care about rules, he didn't care about fairness, and he definitely didn't care about her. The flight attendant came back and tried again. "Ma'am, I truly understand, and I apologize for the delay. But we do have open seats. Would you be willing to just take another seat for now so we can begin boarding?" Jacqueline looked at her. "You're asking me, the person who followed the rules, to be the one who moves?" The attendant hesitated. "I'm just trying to make things easier." "Easier for who?" Jacqueline asked softly. The attendant didn't answer. Instead, she walked away again, clearly frustrated. A few minutes passed. Then something unexpected happened. A man sitting a few rows behind leaned forward and said in a low voice, "You're doing the right thing." His words were quiet, but sincere. Jacqueline nodded in appreciation. Another woman across the aisle smiled at her and gave her a small thumbs up. Slowly, quietly, passengers were starting to show support. Not loudly, but enough to remind Jacqueline that she wasn't alone. Still, most of the cabin was silent. People looked down at their phones or out the windows, pretending not to see what was happening right in front of them. Jacqueline understood why. People were afraid of speaking up, afraid of being uncomfortable. But silence, she knew, often did more harm than noise. The supervisor returned a few minutes later, this time with a more serious expression. He had made some calls, and it was clear that the situation was now being taken seriously. "Sir," he said to the man, "if you do not move to your assigned seat, you will be removed from this flight." The man finally opened his eyes and sat up. "Are you kidding me?" he said loudly. "You're removing me for sitting in an empty seat?" Not empty, Jacqueline said, her voice still calm. It's mine. The supervisor didn't argue. He simply nodded to another airline employee who had come on board. Together, they asked the man to get up. He muttered something under his breath and finally stood. As he grabbed his bag, he looked at Jacqueline one last time. You people always have to make everything about race, he said. That line, those 4 words, cut through the cabin like a knife. Jacqueline didn't respond. She didn't need to. His words said everything about him and nothing about her. The man was escorted off the plane. For a moment, the cabin was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, slowly, passengers began settling back into their seats. The flight attendants resumed their tasks, this time with a different energy. They seemed more alert, more respectful, and more aware. One of them came up to Jacqueline and finally said, "Ma'am, we're so sorry for how this was handled. Your seat is ready." Jacqueline nodded and finally sat down in seat 2A it had. Taken far longer than expected, and the emotional toll was heavier than any carry-on. But she had stood her ground, not just for herself, but for everyone watching as she buckled her seatbelt. She noticed a young girl a few rows back looking at her with wide eyes. The girl smiled shyly and waved. Jacqueline smiled back. That small moment meant everything. She had done the right thing. She had shown that dignity and strength could shine, even in the face of quiet cruelty. The engine started to hum. Flight was preparing for takeoff. Jacqueline leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath. She had earned this seat, and she wasn't giving it up for anyone. The man who had refused to leave Jacqueline's seat was now gone. As he was escorted off the flight, there was a strange silence across the plane, like everyone was trying to pretend the incident had not happened. But it had happened, and Jacqueline could still feel the weight of it. Though she had won the right to sit in the seat she had paid for, the seat she deserved, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions swirling inside her. She sat back in seat 2A, finally able to rest, but her mind was still restless. She looked out the small window, trying to calm herself. Her hands were folded on her lap, but she could feel the leftover tension in her chest. The seat was soft, the area around her peaceful now, but her body remained alert, as if waiting for another confrontation. The flight attendant passed by again and offered her a glass of water, whispering, "Let us know if you need anything, ma'am." Jacqueline gave her a polite nod and a quiet thank you, though she didn't feel like talking much. She wasn't angry, she wasn't upset, but she was exhausted, not just from the moment, but from what it meant. Because what had happened wasn't just about one man in one seat. It was about something bigger, something deeper, something she had seen all her life. 5 minutes after the man was removed, the captain made an announcement through the intercom. His voice was calm but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight delay. Please remain seated while we address a minor situation. We will update you shortly. Thank you for your patience." Jacqueline heard the murmurs begin. Again, she noticed people whispering to one another, some looking over in her direction. A few passengers were openly staring. One woman shook her head, clearly annoyed by the delay. Another leaned toward her companion and whispered, "I wonder what happened." Jacqueline had a feeling some people blamed her. She could read it. In their eyes, to them she had caused trouble. To them, the delay was her fault. But she sat quietly, her chin high, her shoulders relaxed, even though inside she was still processing everything. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She pulled it out and saw a message from her assistant. "Hope your flight is smooth. Let me know when you land. Meeting at 3 p.m. confirmed." She typed back a quick reply. "Delayed. I'll keep you posted." As she put the phone away, the flight attendant came back with a supervisor. This time it was a different person, an older woman with silver hair and a serious face. She knelt slightly next to Jacqueline's seat and spoke in a low tone so other passengers wouldn't hear. "Ms. Evans, I just wanted to personally apologize. What happened earlier should not have happened. The crew has reported the incident, and we're investigating further. We've also flagged the passenger in question. Apparently this is not his first issue with behavior." Jacqueline looked at the woman calmly, not as first. The woman nodded. No, ma'am. He's been reported before. Disrespectful to crew, rude to other passengers. Once even refused to follow safety instructions. He's been given warnings. Today's behavior crossed a line. Jacqueline listened quietly, processing what she heard. So this man, the one who took her seat, disrespected her, and refused to move, had a history. And yet until now, he had continued to travel freely. She felt something cold in her chest. How often do people like that get second chances, third chances, endless chances? And how often are people like her expected to stay quiet, take the insult, and move on? The supervisor continued. The captain has decided not to allow him back on this flight. We've submitted a report to corporate. There may be further consequences. Thank you for letting me know, Jacqueline said, her voice soft but firm. If there's anything we can do to make this right, the supervisor began. Just treat the next person better, Jacqueline said, cutting her off gently. All I ask. The supervisor nodded and left. Jacqueline leaned back again, her mind spinning not with anger, but with reflection. So many times, situations like this happen quietly, behind closed doors, and no one says anything. Today was different. She had stood her ground, and because of that, someone had finally been held accountable. Outside the plane, the sun had risen higher. The light streamed through the window beside her, falling across her face. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply, letting the warmth soothe her, at least for now. But then something else happened. Just when she thought the worst part of the experience was behind her, the captain came out of the cockpit. It was unusual, and passengers began to turn their heads to look. He walked slowly down the aisle, stopped at Jacqueline's seat, and bent slightly. To speak with her, Ms. Evans, he said respectfully. I just wanted to check in personally. We've received the crew's report. You did nothing wrong, and you handled yourself with great dignity. I'm sorry for the way this unfolded. We're now ready for takeoff, but I didn't want to do. So without saying this to you first, Jacqueline was surprised.
Captains rarely came out to speak directly to passengers.
She looked at him and said, Thank you. I appreciate that. The captain nodded. This delay wasn't your fault. Want you to know that. And the team agrees. Those words meant more to her than she expected. Not because she needed validation, but because they were rare. A clear, open acknowledgement. Not a fake smile, not a hidden excuse, but truth. After he walked back to the cockpit, the engines finally began to hum again. The flight attendants took their places and began final checks. The plane was finally preparing to leave. Jacqueline looked across the aisle. A woman was watching her, middle-aged, kind eyes, brown curls. She smiled and mouthed the words, Good for you. Jacqueline smiled back. That small connection felt powerful. It was quiet support, but it mattered. The plane lifted off the ground, rising smoothly into the sky. Clouds floated peacefully beneath them. The tension in the cabin began to fade, replaced by the usual rhythm of flight, seatbelt signs, overhead beeps, soft announcements. Jacqueline pulled out her tablet, opened a document, and began reviewing her notes for the meeting later that day. Her mind was sharp again, focused. But every now and then, her thoughts drifted back to the man who had tried to take her seat. Not just physically, but symbolically. He hadn't seen her as someone who belonged, but she had proved otherwise. She imagined what might have happened. If she had simply moved to another seat, the flight would have taken off on time. The crew would have been relieved. The man would have smirked and gone on with his day. No lesson learned. No justice done. And she would have carried that moment with her like a stone in her chest. Instead, she had refused. And that refusal had stopped everything. 5 minutes after she had been asked to give up her seat, the entire flight had come to a halt. Because truth can't always be ignored. Sometimes, when one person stands still, the whole world is forced to stop and look. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how powerful that simple act had been. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady, quiet, refusing to shrink. That, she believed, was real strength. And it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone watching. The girl across the aisle, the quiet man who whispered, You're doing the right thing. The staff who hesitated then learned. Even the people who stayed silent, they saw it. Jacqueline looked out the window again. The sky was bright now, glowing. The plane was cruising high above the clouds. She took another deep breath. This flight meant to be just another trip. For business had become something else. A moment of truth. And even though the flight had been delayed, something bigger had been moved forward. The plane continued to move smoothly through the sky. After the stressful beginning, things had finally started to settle down. Passengers were relaxed now, reading books, watching movies, or sleeping with eye masks on. The hum of the engines created a soft background noise that felt almost calming. But inside Jacqueline's mind, thoughts were still turning. She sat quietly in seat 2A, gazing out the window. The sky was a peaceful blue, and the clouds below looked like soft cotton stretched across the earth. Everything outside was calm, but Jacqueline felt a mix of emotions inside. She had stood up for herself and stayed strong, but the memory of what had happened was still fresh. She had been disrespected in front of dozens of people. She had been told to move when she had done nothing wrong. And most of all, she had been made to feel that she didn't belong in a place she had every right to be in. A soft chime rang above, and the flight attendant returned to her row. This time her face looked less tense and more thoughtful. Leaned down gently and spoke with a softer voice than before. "Ms. Evans," she said, "I'd like to apologize again for how things happened earlier. It should have been handled better." Jacqueline looked at her. The woman's eyes looked honest this time, not just polite. "I appreciate you saying that," Jacqueline replied calmly. The flight attendant reached into her pocket and took out a small envelope. She handed it to Jacqueline. "This is a voucher from the airline. It's not much, but it's a gesture. We also added a note in your account for complimentary upgrades on your next few flights." Jacqueline took the envelope and gave a small nod. She wasn't angry with this woman. She understood that the flight crew had been placed in an uncomfortable situation. But what bothered her was that the discomfort seemed to always fall on the wrong person. It was never the loud one who caused the trouble. It was the quiet one who demanded fairness, who made people uneasy. "I don't need gifts," she said gently, "but I hope this experience makes a difference for the next person." The attendant paused, then said something unexpected. "I learned something. Today, we all did." She didn't stay long. She simply gave Jacqueline a respectful nod and walked away. For a few minutes, Jacqueline sat with her thoughts. She looked around the cabin. Many of the people who had witnessed the earlier incident were still pretending it hadn't happened. That was how the world often worked. Uncomfortable truths were ignored, hidden, buried beneath polite smiles and silence. But not everyone stayed quiet. A few rows behind, she noticed the man who had whispered earlier, "You're doing the right thing." He was reading a book now, but every so often he looked up and gave her a warm look of support. Across the aisle, the woman with the brown curls was still awake. She leaned over again and whispered, "I admire your strength." Jacqueline smiled softly. "Thank you," she replied. The woman reached across the aisle and offered her hand. "I'm Marlene." "Jacqueline," she said, shaking her hand. Marlene smiled. "I used to be a teacher. I've seen how people treat kids differently just because of how they look. It breaks my heart. What you did today, it means something." Jacqueline nodded slowly. Felt like the right thing to do. "It was," Marlene said. After that, they sat quietly. The moment was small, but it felt meaningful. Jacqueline didn't need everyone to notice what had happened. She didn't need a crowd of supporters. Sometimes even one or two kind people could help you feel less alone. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned once more, but this time she wasn't alone. A young girl followed her, around 10 years old, holding a drawing pad and a pencil. The flight attendant smiled nervously. "Ms. Evans, this is Tiana. She wanted to meet you." Jacqueline turned slightly in her seat and looked at the girl. Tiana had curly hair pulled into 2 small puffs, big brown eyes, and a shy smile. She wore a hoodie that said "Future Leader." Jacqueline's heart melted a little. "Hi, Tiana," she said warmly. The girl stepped closer and held out the drawing pad. "I drew this for you." Jacqueline took the pad and looked at it. It was a simple sketch, drawn with care. It showed a woman in a business suit, sitting in a plain seat with a bright smile. Around her were words like brave, smart, strong, and beautiful. Jacqueline was speechless. "Did you draw this just now?" she asked. Tiana nodded. "I saw what happened. My mom said, sometimes people treat others unfairly. But you didn't let it stop you. I want to be like that when I grow up." Jacqueline felt a lump form in her throat. She blinked slowly, trying to hold back her emotions. She reached out and touched the girl's hand gently. "You already are. Brave," she said softly. "And you're going to be even braver." Tiana smiled, then looked up at the flight attendant, who smiled back. "I'll go back to my seat now." "Thank you, sweetheart," Jacqueline said. As the girl walked away, Jacqueline held the drawing tightly in her hands. It was just paper and pencil, but it felt like a priceless gift. In that moment, she realized that this flight wasn't just about a destination, it was about impact. She wasn't just a passenger in a seat. She was a symbol for every girl watching, for every woman who had been told to be quiet, for every person who had been overlooked. And in standing her ground, she had made space for someone else to believe they could too, as the flight went on. Something else shifted. A different flight attendant, one who hadn't been involved earlier, came by and asked if she would like anything from the special first-class menu. She offered warm cookies, fresh fruit, even a special coffee blend. It wasn't the food that mattered, it was the tone. There was a new respect in their voices now. It wasn't forced, it was real. Jacqueline accepted a coffee and took a sip. It was hot, rich, and just what she needed. She looked out the window again, this time with a sense of peace. She didn't feel angry anymore. She felt proud. Later, as the plane began to descend, the captain made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing to land. Thank you again for your patience earlier and appreciate your understanding." Jacqueline noticed that several passengers glanced at her after the announcement. Some looked uncomfortable. Others nodded slightly, as if silently acknowledging what she had gone through. The wheels touched down smoothly, and the plane rolled to a stop at the gate. Everyone began gathering their things, and the usual noises of landing filled the cabin, seatbelts clicking open, overhead bins being opened, bags sliding out. As Jacqueline stood to collect her bag, a young man nearby stepped aside and said, "After you." His voice was respectful. She thanked him and walked slowly down the aisle, holding the drawing from Tiana in one hand. At the door, the captain stood once again. This time, he extended his hand and said, "Thank you for flying with us, Ms. Evans. We hope to see you again soon." Jacqueline shook his hand. "Thank you for your professionalism," she replied. Once off the plane, she walked down the jet bridge and into the airport. Her assistant was already waiting for her message. She pulled out her phone and typed, "Landed safely. I'll head straight to the hotel and prepare for the meeting." But before she sent it, she opened her photo app and took a picture of Tiana's drawing. She stared at it for a long moment, then finally pressed send. Something had changed in her today. Not her goals. She was still determined to lead, to grow her company, to build the future she dreamed of. But her spirit had deepened. She had always been strong. But now, she knew something else. Even quiet resistance could speak loudly as she exited the airport. She didn't just walk like a CEO. She walked like a woman who had refused to move and helped the world take notice. Jacqueline stepped out of the airport into the warm afternoon sun. The air smelled different, fresh, almost like freedom. She took a deep breath and adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder. Her phone buzzed in her hand with new emails and calendar alerts, but for once, she didn't rush to open them. She needed a moment to breathe, to think, to feel. What had started as a regular business flight had turned into something far more powerful. It was supposed to be just another day, a simple plane ride, a quick trip. But now, after everything that had happened on board, Jacqueline knew something had shifted not only for her, but for everyone who had been part of it. She stepped into a waiting car sent by her company. As she sat down in the back seat, she gently placed her bag beside her and reached in to pull out the drawing Tiana had given her. The words still echoed in her mind. "I want to be like you when I grow up." That moment, more than anything else, had stayed with her. It reminded her why her seat on that plane mattered not just to her, but to every girl watching, every person listening. Even if they said nothing, on the way to her hotel, her phone kept buzzing. She finally opened it and saw dozens of notifications. Her assistant had texted again. "Are you okay? Something is going viral. You're all over social media." Jacqueline raised her eyebrows. She opened the link her assistant had shared. It led to a video posted by a fellow passenger. It wasn't long, just under a minute, but it showed her standing beside her seat on the plane, calm but firm. The caption above it read, "This black woman refused to give up her seat to a rude man and the whole flight had to stop. Stood her ground with class. Respect." The video had over 2 million views. She scrolled through the comments. People from all over the world were responding. Total queen energy. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just stood there and showed strength. This is what quiet power looks like. I want my daughter to see this. Jacqueline sat back in the seat, stunned. She hadn't asked for this attention. She hadn't expected the moment to be captured. But it had been, and now people were talking, not just about the seat, but about what it represented. More messages came in. Journalists asking for interviews, friends sending her screenshots, colleagues tagging her in posts. She saw a message from a former employee who had once doubted her leadership, now saying, "You've always been stronger than the rest of us. Today, you proved it again." The car reached the hotel. Jacqueline thanked the driver and went up to her room. Once inside, she sat on the edge of the bed, still holding her phone. She felt overwhelmed, but also deeply seen. She had always worked hard to be noticed for her intelligence, her strategy, her leadership. But today, people were seeing her for something else, her dignity. She looked again at the video. The comments kept coming. One was from a mother who wrote, "My 12-year-old daughter saw your video and said, 'That's what a real leader looks like. Thank you for showing her what courage is.'" Jacqueline read the message twice, then smiled. The truth was, she hadn't stood there to make a point. She had just wanted to sit in the seat she had paid for, the one she had earned through years of hard work. But sometimes simple actions have powerful meaning, and when you stand your ground, others rise with you even if they're quiet about it. Later that evening, Jacqueline attended the board meeting as planned. She walked into the room dressed in a new navy blue suit, head held high, posture tall. The people in the room didn't know what had happened that morning, at least not yet. They saw her the way they always had, confident, prepared, professional. She led the meeting smoothly, answered questions sharply, and closed the session with her usual poise. But something felt different. Even as she spoke about business growth and quarterly targets, she carried something more within her, a new layer of strength. Born not in the boardroom, but in the cabin of an airplane, after the meeting. As she walked toward the elevator, a board member stopped her. He had seen the video. "You handled that with real grace," he said. "My daughter showed me the clip. She's a teenager. You've become her new role model." Jacqueline smiled and thanked him, but inside she was humbled. She hadn't planned for any of this. She hadn't wanted attention. But now, she was being seen in a new light, not just as a CEO, but as a symbol of self-respect. By the next day, her story had spread to major news outlets. Headlines read, "Black woman CEO refuses to give up first-class seat, flight halted." And Grace in the Sky? How one passenger inspired millions. Some of the articles mentioned her by name. Others focused on the meaning behind her actions, about racial bias, about quiet discrimination, about the courage to say no. One news anchor said on air, "She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She stood in silence, and the world paid attention." Jacqueline read the articles, still unsure how to feel. Part of her was proud. Another part of her was tired. Being a role model was a heavy responsibility, but she didn't regret a single second. Her email inbox filled with messages from CEOs, teachers, college students, parents. One message stood out. It was from a black teenage girl who had recently started a business selling handmade jewelry. She wrote, "I was going to quit because no one takes me seriously. But after watching you, I'm going to keep going. You for showing me that we deserve to take up space." Jacqueline closed the email and wiped her eyes gently. She had spent so much of her life proving she belonged in certain rooms, certain seats, certain conversations. Now, she had become a reminder to others that they belonged to. A few days later, the airline sent her a personal letter of apology. It was signed by the CEO himself. In it, they acknowledged the crew's failure to act faster, promised new training for bias awareness, and even asked if Jacqueline would be open to consulting with them on improving passenger experiences for underrepresented groups. She didn't say yes immediately, but she didn't say no either. 1 week later, she was invited to speak at a leadership summit. The organizer had seen the video and wanted her to give a talk not just about business, but about character. Jacqueline agreed, though she felt nervous. She was used to discussing strategies and numbers, not personal stories, but when she stood on stage in front of the audience, she told them everything. Not just about the man who took her seat, but about all the small moments in life when she had been told to move, to wait, to let things go, and about the one moment she didn't. The audience gave her a standing ovation. After the event, people lined up to speak with her. One woman in tears said, "You changed how I see myself." Another said, "You gave me courage to stand up at work for the first time." It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about being seen, being heard, respected. Weeks passed, and the story slowly faded from headlines. New stories replaced it. But for the people who had watched Jacqueline's quiet stand, the moment stayed alive in their minds. The video still got shared. The drawing from Tiana was still pinned above Jacqueline's desk. And Jacqueline, she kept going, leading her company, mentoring young women, speaking at events when invited. She didn't let fame change her. She didn't let attention distract her. She stayed grounded, focused herself. But now, whenever she walked through an airport, people sometimes recognized her. A flight attendant once whispered, "You're the one who didn't move, right?" with a proud smile. A young girl once ran up and said, "I saw your video. You're amazing." Jacqueline always thanked them kindly but reminded them, "You're amazing too." She kept flying. She kept working. Something had changed forever. She no longer saw her seat as just a place to sit. She saw it as a reminder that we all have a place in this world, and no one has the right to take it from us.